An emotional outburst today in the Michael Jackson wrongful death trial. A nurse practitioner broke down and sobbed as she testified at the end of today's proceeding.
There are some stories that never really fade. No matter how many years pass, no matter how many headlines come and go, they stay alive because something about them still feels unfinished. Michael Jackson's death is one of those stories. It was not just the death of a global superstar. It was the collapse of a man the world thought was untouchable, and the details that emerged afterward only made the tragedy darker, stranger, and more painful. For years, people have argued over what really happened in those final hours. Some blamed addiction. Some blamed pressure. Some blamed the doctor in the room. Others believed there was a much bigger machinery at work behind the scenes. But when witnesses began speaking under oath, and when a nurse practitioner described what Michael had been saying before his death, the story stopped feeling like rumor and started feeling like a warning that nobody was willing to hear in time. One of the most chilling parts of this entire case is that the end did not come out of nowhere. It did not begin at the hospital. It did not begin when paramedics rushed through the gates. It did not even begin when Michael stopped breathing. It began earlier, in smaller moments, in quiet admissions, in fear, in exhaustion, in sleepless nights, and in desperate conversations about a drug that should never have become part of his private life. The nurse who later testified was Cherilyn Lee. And what made her account so haunting was not that she claimed to witness the very last second of his life, but that she described a man already trapped long before the final collapse. According to her testimony, Michael was struggling with severe insomnia. Not ordinary insomnia. Not the kind that leaves you tired the next day. This was a level of desperation that had pushed him toward wanting something far more dangerous than sleep medication. He was asking about propofol, a powerful anesthetic used in medical settings, not in a private bedroom, not for routine rest, and certainly not as a nightly shortcut to unconsciousness. That is where the real horror begins. Because if someone is asking for a drug like that just to sleep, you are no longer hearing about a celebrity inconvenience. You are hearing about a body and mind pushed into a condition that no natural rhythm can fix. And when Lee told the court that she warned him against it, when she made it clear that no one who truly cared about him should be giving him that drug at home, her words landed like a prophecy. She was not talking theoretically. She was describing a line that should never be crossed. And yet that line was crossed. By the time Michael Jackson arrived at UCLA Medical Center, the physicians there were not receiving a patient in crisis. They were receiving a body already on the edge of irreversible loss. Testimony from the emergency room made that brutally clear. Dr. Rochelle Cooper said he was clinically dead on arrival. No pulse. No meaningful sign that the heart was functioning in a way that gave the team a realistic chance. Think about what that means. The most famous entertainer in the world, a man whose face and voice had reached every corner of the planet, arrived at the hospital not as a comeback icon, not as a performer preparing for another chapter, but as someone whose final chance may already have disappeared before the ambulance doors even opened. But the tragedy becomes even darker when you look at what the hospital team did not know. Because in emergency medicine, time matters. Information matters. A single missing detail can change the logic of treatment. And according to testimony, Dr. Conrad Murray did not tell the full story. He did not immediately reveal propofol to the emergency personnel the way he should have. Instead, witnesses described a frantic scene in which doctors were working without critical knowledge of what had really been administered. That omission changed everything about how the story feels. Because now this was not just about a man dying. It was about a medical team fighting blind. Dr. Tao Nguyen later described the urgency, the desperation, and the emotional force with which Murray urged the hospital staff not to give up. On the surface, that sounds like devotion. It sounds like a doctor begging for a patient's life. But testimony also suggested that when the team tried to understand what drugs Michael had received, clear answers did not come. And that creates one of the most unsettling contradictions in the entire case. If you are truly trying to save a man, why withhold the one detail that could help others understand what they are fighting? That question hangs over the whole story like a shadow. Because once you follow the testimony backward from the hospital to the house, the scene becomes even more disturbing. Paramedics who responded that day testified that when they arrived, Michael already looked as if he had been gone longer than they were being told. His skin was cool. His eyes were open. His pupils were dilated. The monitor showed no electrical activity. One paramedic made it plain that the story he was hearing from Murray did not match what his training and experience were telling him. That gap between visible reality and spoken explanation is one of the reasons this case still grips people. Everyone understands panic. Everyone understands shock. But when physical evidence, witness testimony, and medical statements begin pulling away from the official explanation, the emotional center of the story shifts. It stops feeling like an accident unfolding in real time and starts feeling like people are trying to catch up to the truth after it has already been buried under fear, confusion, and self-protection. And then came one of the most damaging pieces of testimony of all. Security and staff accounts described a moment before the emergency call when medical items and vials were being gathered. Alberto Alvarez testified that Murray instructed him to put items into a bag before 911 was called. Whether someone wants to argue panic, habit, or something more sinister, the image itself is devastating. A man is down, the situation is catastrophic, and yet the room is not moving with the clean singular purpose of emergency rescue. It is moving with distraction, with concealment, with decisions that feel impossible to separate from self-preservation. That image matters because stories survive through pictures people can hold in their minds. And this is one of the images that never leaves. The bedroom, the chaos, the urgency, the confusion, the commands, the seconds slipping away, and a doctor who should have been singularly focused on saving a life instead creating questions that would haunt the case forever. There was also the testimony about the call for help. Michael Amir Williams described Murray saying that Michael had a bad reaction and that someone needed to get there immediately. Those words are important because they sound less like a carefully structured medical report and more like a man realizing that something irreversible may already have happened. In a crisis, language reveals truth before strategy has time to catch up. And when witnesses began reconstructing those moments, the emotional temperature of the case changed. The panic seemed real. But so did the sense that the full truth was not being spoken in one clean, honest line. Inside the house, others saw the collapse from different angles. Kai Chase described Murray racing downstairs in distress, calling for help, shouting, sounding shaken. Fahim Mohammed later described seeing Michael on the bed with his eyes and mouth open and witnessing CPR being performed in a way that raised serious questions. On a soft bed, every chest compression loses force. Every second matters. And when basic emergency actions themselves become points of concern, the case no longer feels like one fatal mistake. It feels like a chain of errors, each one compounding the next. That is one of the reasons this story remains so emotionally devastating. It is not just the fact of death. It is the sense that so many different points existed where the outcome might have changed if someone had acted sooner, acted differently, spoken more clearly, refused more firmly, or simply put the patient above everything else. And then there is the autopsy, the cold scientific center of the case, the place where emotion gives way to forensic fact. Dr. Christopher Rogers testified that the cause of death was acute propofol intoxication. The manner of death was homicide. Those are words that carry extraordinary weight. Not rumor. Not internet theory. Not tabloid suspicion. Official forensic language. And with that, the story hardened. This was no longer only a narrative of insomnia and desperation. It became a case in which a deadly medical act, or series of acts, had crossed into criminal responsibility. Rogers also rejected the idea that Michael somehow delivered the fatal dose to himself in the way the defense suggested. That mattered because self-administration would have shifted the emotional and legal frame. It would have turned the narrative more heavily toward self-destruction. But testimony pushed back against that version, arguing that the circumstances did not support it. And so the focus returned to the person who had the training, the access, the drugs, the authority, and the duty to protect. That duty became even more central when Dr. Stephen Shafer testified. His words cut with unusual force because he was not speaking loosely. He was speaking as an anesthesiology expert who understood exactly what propofol is, how it works, what it requires, and what standards govern its use. He described violation after violation. He made clear that propofol is not a bedtime solution. It is not a celebrity convenience. It is a powerful anesthetic that belongs inside strict medical safeguards. By framing Murray as someone behaving more like an obedient employee than an independent physician, Shafer put the moral failure into plain language. A real doctor is supposed to say no. That may be the simplest and most painful truth in the entire story. A real doctor is supposed to say no. No when the request is dangerous. No when the environment is unsafe. No when the patient is desperate but the treatment is reckless. No when money, pressure, fame, fear, or access start blurring the line between care and compliance. And once that line disappears, everybody becomes vulnerable. The broader context only makes the story more tragic. Michael Jackson was in the middle of preparing for an enormous comeback. The pressure around the This Is It shows was intense. Rehearsals were demanding. Expectations were astronomical. His body, reputation, finances, legacy, and identity were all tied to proving that he could still do what the world expected of Michael Jackson. That kind of pressure does not just sit outside a person. It enters the bloodstream. It changes sleep. It changes fear. It changes judgment. And witnesses from the rehearsal world made it painfully clear that concern about his condition existed before the final day. Kenny Ortega's testimony remains one of the most emotionally revealing pieces of the entire puzzle. He described Michael as weak, cold, fragile, paranoid, emotionally unsettled. He said he saw someone who frightened him. That is not the language of ordinary stage fatigue. That is the language of a person watching another human being slip into a state that feels unstable, urgent, and unsustainable. Ortega even wrote messages expressing concern that Michael needed help. He was not describing a man in full command of his body and mind. He was describing someone barely holding on. That matters because it destroys the illusion of suddenness. This was not a lightning strike out of a clear sky. There were signs. There were warnings. There were moments that should have stopped the machine. But the machine kept moving. That machine was built from more than one force. It was built from celebrity expectation, financial pressure, physical decline, insomnia, dependency, fear of failure, loyalty, enabling, and the toxic mythology that stars are somehow capable of surviving what would destroy anyone else. When someone like Michael Jackson begins deteriorating, the people around him do not always react with clarity. Some protect. Some deny. Some obey. Some rationalize. Some panic. Some profit. And that is what makes these stories so terrifying. They are rarely caused by one emotion. They are caused by a system. His family's testimony added another layer that no medical chart can capture. Katherine Jackson spoke about exhaustion and pressure. Prince and Paris gave voice to the emotional cost inside the home. Their testimony did not need clinical terminology to be powerful. Children do not speak in legal strategy. They speak in memory, in fear, in the small details that reveal atmosphere. What they described was not just a father with a schedule. It was a man under crushing strain, surrounded by demands too large for any fragile person to carry safely. And that is why the nurse's testimony still resonates so strongly. Because before the courtroom had all the technical language, before experts broke down blood levels and dosing theory, there was already this simple, human, heartbreaking reality. Michael Jackson was desperate for sleep. Desperate enough to reach for something dangerous. Desperate enough to ask questions that should have frightened every responsible adult around him. Desperate enough that when one person warned him, someone else eventually gave him what should never have been normalized. Imagine the loneliness inside that. To be Michael Jackson at that stage of life was to be trapped in one of the strangest paradoxes possible. He was surrounded by people, yet profoundly isolated. He was worshipped globally, yet deeply vulnerable in private. He could command attention from millions, yet apparently could not secure the one thing every human being needs without risk: safe sleep. When a person of that scale reaches a point where rest becomes a medical gamble, fame stops looking glamorous. It starts looking like a prison with expensive curtains. And this is where the story becomes larger than one day, one doctor, or one verdict. Because Michael Jackson's death speaks to something society repeatedly gets wrong. We tend to confuse access with care. We assume that because someone can have any specialist, any treatment, any luxury, they must also be protected. But access without boundaries is not protection. In the wrong hands, it becomes a pathway to disaster. If nobody is willing to stop a powerful person from self-damaging requests, then privilege starts functioning like exposure. By the time Michael reached the hospital, so much had already been decided before those doctors ever touched him. The deprivation, the nightly chemical interventions, the unsafe environment, the delayed clarity, the missing honesty, the panic inside the room, the pressure outside the room. The entire chain had been tightening around him long before the final ambulance ride. And that is why the hospital testimony feels so crushing. It is the moment when all illusion falls away. The glamour is gone. The comeback is gone. The mythology is gone. What remains is a body, a room full of doctors, a desperate physician, and the impossible effort to reverse what should never have happened. One of the reasons people still return to this case is because it contains both intimacy and enormity. It is the death of a legend, yes. But it is also the story of a vulnerable human being in a bedroom, unable to sleep, relying on the wrong answer, surrounded by a culture that had long confused performance with survival. When the nurse warned him, she was trying to pull him back toward the ordinary rules of life and medicine. But by then, maybe ordinary rules no longer held enough power over the world he was living in. And that is tragic in a way that goes far beyond celebrity. Because the final image is not just Michael Jackson dying. It is Michael Jackson reaching the end of a long exhaustion that too many people saw, too many people worried about, and too few people truly stopped. The testimony gave the public fragments. A nurse describing the danger. Emergency doctors describing the hopeless condition. Paramedics describing what did not add up. Security staff describing the room. Experts describing the violations. Family describing the pressure. Put together, those fragments create a portrait that is far more disturbing than any single headline. This was not simply a private medical crisis. It was the collapse point of a whole environment that had become unable to protect the person at its center. And maybe that is the hardest truth of all. Michael Jackson did not just need treatment. He needed protection. Protection from the pressure. Protection from the schedule. Protection from dependency. Protection from people who said yes when they should have said no. Protection from a standard of living where the extraordinary became normal and the dangerous became routine. Instead, the system kept feeding the illusion that he could continue functioning indefinitely if the next solution, the next sedative, the next reassurance, the next rehearsal, the next night's rest could just get him through one more day. But the body always tells the truth in the end. It told the truth in the insomnia. It told the truth in the shaking. It told the truth in the fear. It told the truth in the hospital. And it told the truth in the autopsy. That is why this case still feels unfinished emotionally even though the legal chapters have long been written. The verdict answered some questions, but it did not erase the deeper unease. People still sense that what happened to Michael Jackson was bigger than a single mistake made in isolation. It was the final expression of an environment that had normalized impossibility. He was expected to be superhuman on stage while remaining chemically held together off stage. He was expected to meet a legend standard while living in a failing body. He was expected to perform brilliance while privately losing rest, stability, and safety. No one can survive that forever. And so when people hear the nurse's testimony today, when they hear about those warnings, when they hear what the doctors at the hospital encountered, the story lands with renewed force. Because hidden inside all the courtroom detail is a brutally simple line: this did not have to happen the way it did. Warnings existed. Witnesses existed. Concern existed. Knowledge existed. Medical standards existed. What failed was the barrier between danger and access. Michael Jackson spent a lifetime giving the world spectacle. But his death stripped spectacle away and revealed something much more haunting. A deeply fragile man asking for sleep in a world that had forgotten how to protect him from what he wanted. That is why the case still hurts. That is why people still watch. That is why every testimony still echoes. Because in the end, the story is not only about the final minutes at the hospital. It is about the fatal road that led him there. A road marked by exhaustion, fear, enabling, secrecy, pressure, and one catastrophic surrender after another. And long after the music stopped, long after the crowds went silent, long after the courtroom lights dimmed, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The greatest tragedy was not only that Michael Jackson died. It was that so many signs of danger appeared before the end, and the people with the power to stop it failed him anyway.